Alors, on va commencer.
So let's
Bonjour tout le
start.
monde.
Hello, everyone.
Commencez. Bienvenue à la session
As I
webinaire
said, welcome to
sur
this webinar series
solutions climatiques
on
pour défier l'avenir.
nature-based climate
Pour ceux
solutions.
qui ne me
For
connaissent pas,
those
je
who
m'appelle
don't
Charles
know
Thibodeau.
me, my name is
Je suis
Charles Thibodeau,
coordonnateur du
and I am
programme
the
des approches fondées sur la nature
Nature-Based
ici
Climate
au réseau
Approaches Program
environnemental du
Coordinator
Nouveau-Brunswick.
here at
Je
the
serai votre hôte
New
pour
Brunswick
tout le
Environmental
webinaire.
Network. I will be your host for this
For
webinar
those who don't know me,
series.
my name is Charles Thibodeau, and I'm the Nature-Based Climate Approaches Program Coordinator here at the New Brunswick Environmental Network. I will be your host for this webinar series. Un rappel que l'interprétation simultanée est disponible.
A
Si vous en
reminder
avez
that
besoin,
simultaneous
choisissez
interpretation is
l'icône Zoom
available. If you need it,
appropriée dans le
choose the
bas.
appropriate Zoom
Ça
icon.
vous le
That's the
dit.
globe on Zoom.
A reminder that simultaneous translation is available. Please select the appropriate interpretation Zoom button on the bottom of your screen. If you do not require translation, stay here in the main channel. Also, reminder that this webinar will be recorded or is being recorded and will be shared with participants at the end of the series. So let's begin. Pour débuter, j'aimerais commencer par reconnaître que je me
So
retrouve
I'd like to
aujourd'hui
start
sur les terres
by
non cédées
acknowledging
du
that
peuple
I am
Mi'kmaq,
currently on
mais que les
unceded
gens
Mi'kmaq
qui
land,
résident
but that most of
virtuellement
the
pour la
people
plupart se
participating
retrouvent également
virtually
sur les terres
are
non
also
cédées du peuple
unceded
Mi'kmaq,
Mi'kmaq,
Wolastoqey,
Wolastoqey,
Passamaquoddy et Wabanaki.
Passamaquoddy, and many other
Le
people's
grand
lands.
territoire où je me
This large
retrouve
territory
s'appelle
where I am located is
Wabanaki
called
et est
Wabanaki
couvert par les traités de
and
paix
is
et
covered by the
d'amitié qui
peace
étaient
and
faits par
friendship
signer pour la
treaties
première
that
fois
these
avec la
peoples first
Colombie-Britannique en
signed with the British Crown in
1756. Les traités
1726.
ne portaient
The
pas sur la
treaties did
cession
not
des terres et
deal
des
with
ressources,
the transfer
mais
of land and
reconnaissaient en fait
resources,
les
but
titres de
instead
territoire,
recognized the titles of these
établissaient des
people
règles
and
de ce qui
establishes the
devait être une
rules for
relation
what was to be an
permanente
ongoing
entre les nations.
relationship between
Je
nations.
demande que nous
I ask that we
saisissions
all
tous
take
cette
this
occasion pour réfléchir à
opportunity
notre
to
relation
reflect
avec
on
la
our
Terre
relationship with the
et au
land
processus
and
continu de
the ongoing
colonisation et de
process of colonization
décolonisation
and
qui a un
decolonization
impact
that
profond sur le
has
travail des
a
activistes et
profound
des
impact on the work of
environnementalistes.
activists and
Le concept
environmentalists.
de la vision à
The
deux yeux,
concepts of
de la
two-eyed seeing,
planification sur 7
seven generations
ans
planning,
et d'autres formes de
and
connaissances
other
traditionnelles
forms
autochtones
of
sont
traditional indigenous
essentielles pour
knowledge
assurer un
are
avenir
essential to
durable
ensuring a
à notre
sustainable
planète.
future for our planets.
For those who do not know where I work, the New Brunswick Environmental Network was established in 1991 and is a communication network that links together some 100 nonprofit environmental organizations in this province. Why is the NBEN working on nature-based solutions? They help promote our member organizations and their work, especially watershed associations and citizens groups. Also, for a nature-based solution to be effective, communication and cooperation with many different groups, be it public, private, government, must be at the core of the solution. And finally, nature-based solutions are not only cost-effective and last longer than conventional gray infrastructure, but also address climate change and sustainable development goals. So welcome to part 3 of this 4-part webinar series on the topic Accelerating the Adoption of Nature-Based Solution. Thanks again for joining us. From the beginning of the planning of this web series, we wanted to provide a structured and informative sessions that will help equip participants with the knowledge and tools needed to successfully incorporate and accelerate the adoption of nature-based solutions in their communities. It aims to educate participants on the benefits and implementation of nature-based climate solutions, provide case studies and practical examples of successful integration of green infrastructure projects, and discuss the financial, environmental, and social advantages of nature-based solutions, included avoided costs from extreme weather events and reduced liabilities for municipalities. With this in mind, we developed this 4-part webinar series. Let's begin, or let's continue on with part 3. So part 3 is entitled Community Engagement and Co-Creation. Our 2 speakers today will be Michelle Sawka. Michelle is Associate Director of the Action on Climate team at Simon Fraser University, and they will present on co-creating knowledge across sectors. We also have Louise Adongo, who is a principal consultant and founder of Caprivian Strip Incorporated. She will discuss building strong, inclusive paths to climate solutions at the community level. So with this being said, let's begin with Michelle Sawka. Michelle is an environmental scientist who works with municipalities and other partners to integrate nature-based solutions and climate change into policy and management systems. She is currently the Associate Director of the Action on Climate team, yeah, and a research to practice think tank based out of Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Thanks for joining us today so early from the West Coast, Michelle. I'll give you a few times so you can load your presentation, a few seconds there and take over. Perfect. Over to you.
Thank you, Charles, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it is a little bit early here, but I think I'm ready to go, and I'm excited to connect with you all today about the work we're doing at ACT, the Action on Climate team, on applying systems thinking through local action. And I am based currently on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation here in what is currently called Vancouver. So at ACT, what we focus on is co-creating solutions with community partners, furthering implementation of both nature-based solutions and low-carbon resilience approaches. We also translate interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research into practical, usable guidance for communities. And in turn, what we learn through working alongside communities feeds back into research undertaking at the university, helping shape future studies around real world priorities and needs. I mentioned low carbon resilience, and it's not the topic of my presentation today or this webinar series, but it is worth mentioning because it is the pathway through which ACT got involved in nature-based solutions. So low carbon resilience is really about identifying climate action approaches that address risk, reduce emissions, and have co-benefits, ideally all at the same time. And when we look at climate action through this lens, nature-based solutions are an incredibly useful approach. They check all those boxes, and there's not that many climate approaches that do check all those boxes. Okay, great. We know that nature-based solutions provide a ton of benefits. We can value some of them. We can make business cases. That's what you've seen if you've attended the previous webinars, I'm sure. How do we actually do this in a way that keeps the broader environmental system in mind and centers local needs and local actions? How do we facilitate those cross-boundary and cross-sectoral works that are required in order to advance nature-based solutions in our communities? So I'm going to walk through our framework for doing this. It is called the Natural Solutions Initiatives. And I'm going to go into a couple short examples as I go through this and one more in-depth example. But we're really operating through the lens of three nested approaches for implementing nature-based solutions. At the largest scale, we're talking about ecosystem-based management. And then nested within that, we focus on natural asset management and the implementation of green infrastructure. And this framework is going to inform the rest of my presentation, and I'll explain more about each one of these pieces as we go through it. Starting with the biggest piece, ecosystem-based management. This really is that big picture systems thinking, watershed or bioregional scale approaches, monitoring ecosystems over time and adjusting actions to manage risk, to assess change. It is almost always interjurisdictional, requires collaboration, it requires long-term thinking, and this really isn't the forte of our current political and economic systems. Now, I mentioned examples, and it's partly because I really like examples. That's how I personally learn. So I want to talk about one of our projects with the Saanich Peninsula Environmental Coalition. If you are unfamiliar, the Saanich Peninsula is located on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. If you have ever taken a ferry or an airplane to Victoria, BC, you've actually landed on the Saanich Peninsula. It's just north of Victoria. It is the territory of the Wasatch people, and it is a predominantly rural area with lots of nature, shorelines, agriculture. One more developed municipality that's called Sydney, BC. And the Saanich Peninsula Environmental Coalition, or SPEC, is a coalition of community organizations and environmental stewards working together across the peninsula. And their shared goal is protecting and restoring the region's natural systems. SPEC is working towards implementation of a bioregional planning framework. The peninsula isn't a particularly large area, but they do have three different municipal governments, a regional district, three Wasanich reserve areas, that they have land that has been given back to the Wasanich people and is currently run by a trust, and an airport, which is, if you have an airport in your jurisdiction, which you'll probably know is federal land. So, from an ecological perspective, even in this small area, there is a significant need for collaboration, but a capacity gap because each of those organizations individually is quite small. So SPEC's bioregional framework has three priorities: ecosystem integrity, that's the nature piece, jurisdictional collaboration, and then community perspective driving these. And what is especially powerful with this framework is that it's not just ecological, it's community informed. So local stewardship groups, traditional knowledge holders, and residents help identify priorities, pressures, and opportunities on the ground. And SPEC helps translate community stewardship into regional impact, making sure, again, that local knowledge actually informs broader planning and action. So these are some of SPEC's activity areas. Again, their member groups are leading on the ground stewardship. So this is not SPEC's role. SPEC really undertakes public surveys, they host events, connecting people to the idea of the broader ecological region that they live in. They bring in experts, they review progress on implementation of bioregional planning in official community plans and other policies. And then every 4 years, bringing this knowledge together to inform municipal elections. And this is where we at ACT have come in to help. These types of coalitions tend to lack significant resources here, so we can access applied research funding streams and have students help with this work. And then ideally, SPEC's work also influences that student's PhD or master's research, and it's really a collaborative relationship. So one example with a master's student, we recently conducted a public opinion survey and outreach at community events on municipal implementation of bioregional planning. So really focusing on that jurisdictional collaboration piece. And one of our collective learnings from that survey was that residents who took the survey or who we were able to talk to, their biggest concern was not the lack of policy, but a gap between what is written in policy or what they understand to be written in policy and what is actually happening on the ground. And this is shifting some of SPEC's outreach to push more for jurisdictional collaboration at the project level, not only at the planning and policy level. So essentially, it can be in the policy, but when projects are being implemented, still not involve collaboration between those municipalities. So trying to get ahead of those ecological projects that are happening, including things like canopy cover assessments or natural asset inventories, and really encouraging those few people who work at each of those municipalities to work together on those types of projects, as well as restoration projects and things like that. Another learning I wanted to touch on is you might have noticed at the beginning I talked about watersheds and bioregions. And at ACT, we had been really pushing for watershed scale work. And frankly, we categorize this project within our project planning as a watershed scale project. But what we heard from SPEC partners and community members is that they don't connect with the concept of a watershed. We pulled up watershed mapping with the regional district that's on the slide here. We walked folks through why watersheds are really important. But really, there are at least 22 small watersheds across a fairly small peninsula, and the people, the community, just don't identify with that concept. They see themselves and they pride themselves on being a peninsula bioregion. It's a very unique ecosystem with a lot of very unique ecology. So we have learned a lot through this project, and we now emphasize that it's really important to consider what kind of ecological unit at that ecosystem management scale makes the most sense with the community if you're going to start working with them. And it isn't always the watershed scale. And so this can be one of those key advantages of co-creating and community-informed nature-based solutions work. We can always learn and evolve our perspectives together. Now, I also wanted to touch on another example of that ecosystem-based management, and this is ACT's work on watershed health and resilience indicators. I was chuckling to myself because I'm going from a slide on how watersheds aren't always the best scale to a watershed focused report. But our learning is continuous and watersheds are still important in some contexts. So what our focus now is about also bringing bioregions into those conversations. And this work is really about rethinking whose knowledge counts in how we understand and care for watersheds and bioregions. And this is some really initial work that works with a couple Indigenous scholars to link place-based Indigenous knowledge systems and practices with ecosystem management. That means indicators aren't always based on biophysical data like water quality or vegetation cover. They can also be informed by long-standing relationships with the land and water, seasonal knowledge, and observations built over generations. And this work found that most watershed monitoring indicators are focused on Western science. So it really emphasizes the potential to co-create indicators with Indigenous community members, indicators that truly rethink knowledge systems, indicators to consider like fish smell or continuity of harvesting practices, the number of community-led stewardship initiatives that can help center traditional knowledge and work together with Western science to provide a more cohesive perspective on ecosystem-based management. And then it's also a really wonderful opportunity to build relationship and an opportunity for us to be quiet and listen more than we talk. All right, so I am going to touch on one of the other two key approaches nested under ecosystem-based management. The first one is natural asset management. This is the practice of identifying, valuing, and managing natural assets to provide critical municipal services. That is, we're trying to get nature-based solutions appreciated and managed just like any other piece of infrastructure within municipalities, not as nice to haves. So whether that's a forest that provides recreation space, like in the picture here, or a wetland that helps manage stormwater, the goal with natural asset management is to make sure these services are visible in decision making and that they're accounted for in asset management plans and funded in municipal budgets and maintained over time so that they can deliver those services to our communities. And one of the great features of asset management is the process itself requires developing levels of service that start with the perspective of the community. And then we can get into those technical metrics. We often, at least I'm guilty of wanting to skip over and get to those technical metrics, but you have to start with community, and the process really centers community in those service conversations. Now, okay, that sounds great, but how does this actually look in practice? We have found that there's really two complementary but different fundamental approaches to natural asset management. The first is the integration of natural assets into those traditional asset management plans. This is that practice of bringing forests and wetlands and street trees into traditional asset management systems used for infrastructure like roads and facilities. There are lots of municipalities in Canada who have done this. Canada is really a world leader on this particular topic, and we can learn from many of those municipalities, especially municipalities of all sizes in Ontario, where they have a regulation that's really helped driving this. And the second fundamental approach is the integration of natural assets into other municipal plans, policies, and bylaws. And I'm not going to focus on this topic today, but if you want to learn more, I have linked to a report in the slide deck, which you'll receive from Charles after the presentations today. And one of the ways the natural asset management approach is evolving really quickly is through technology. Apps are popping up and they're making it much easier to understand the nature that we have and where it is. I have been finding that even small communities with limited capacity are now able to start building tree inventories because staff, even those without specialized forestry training, which most municipalities don't have, can now use apps that help you map, and this is key, help you identify different tree species. And this is also exciting because it continues to open the door to community science. So, community science or citizen science, this isn't new, and these initiatives have been around for a long time. But I think the opportunity to fully integrate that data into municipal decision making is really growing because the accuracy of that data is improving rapidly with the help of technology. Okay, so the final nature-based solution approach in our framework is green infrastructure. This is the planning and scaling of human-made or engineered ecosystems like rain gardens and green roofs. Now, the definition of green infrastructure really varies depending on where you are in Canada, but for the purposes of our framework, it focuses on those site and neighborhood level nature-based solutions. But this is aligned very closely with how the US defines it, except that it's not just about stormwater management. So this is an example of a before and after shot from my neighborhood in Vancouver. There was a street that had been blocked off for decades and it was barely used and people would avoid it when they're walking. It has been turned into a greenway with rain gardens and open grassy areas and benches. My kids love to bike around there, and there's a group of gardeners in the area that helps keep the gardens maintained. And it has really gone from an unused space to a beautiful place to connect with our neighbors. Yes, the rain gardens, they're managing stormwater runoff. And yes, that vegetation is cooling the area and supporting biodiversity, but it is also creating social resilience in our community. And when we use nature-based solutions to talk about creating places where people actually want to spend time, where they meet their neighbors, where kids play, where people feel safer walking or cycling, there's a stronger sense of belonging and shared ownership of that space. And social connection really matters during times of stress. That's whether that's extreme heat, which we had in 2021, heavy rainfall, or a natural disaster. Neighbors who know each other are more likely to check in, to share information, and to support each other. And we've really heard this message through our work with communities, and we've been bringing it in particular into discussions around housing development. So, shifting some of our focus when we're talking about nature-based solutions from those technical stormwater and biodiversity benefits towards messaging that's co-created and is more people-focused around resilience. And you can implement this both at a neighborhood scale and like this infographic shows when we're doing multifamily developments, as we're creating more dense housing because we need more housing. How do we integrate nature-based solutions into this housing? And we don't just do it for the stormwater benefits, but we also do it for the social resiliency benefits that it provides. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Charles, and the team for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to come speak to everyone.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was great. If anybody has questions, we do have a few minutes. If not, that's fine. We can uh, maybe entertain some questions for both Michelle and Louise after Louise's presentation. So I don't see any hands raised or anything, so let's move on. Just going to share my slides again here. So now I'd like to welcome Louise Adongo to the virtual stage here. Louise has extensive experiences in system change, policy, evaluation, strategic planning, and governance, helping municipalities understand why climate plans often stall and how to overcome those hurdles. Emphasizing the importance of fostering collaboration between municipalities, community organizations, and local residents, and ensuring that climate strategies are not only sustainable, but also inclusive and community driven. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation, Louise. Over to you. I'm going to stop sharing here so you can start sharing yours.
Okay, thank you. While I am sharing my screen, I'm doing this from a place with a wonderful cat or kitten who may come out and jump on me while I'm presenting. And if I startle, that's why. Also, just want to say that I don't know if I have understood how to overcome hurdles, more commiserating with different levels of government and different community groups and different community organizations. Hopefully my presentation is not going to be that long, so we can have some time for questions and discussion. Also, I'm going to try to remind myself to speak slower and take breaths. Really appreciate that I'm speaking after Michelle. I think as you listen to the two presentations together, you'll see that they're really complementary. I wrote this down because it really, to me, centered probably what I'm going to say. Michelle talked about whose knowledge counts, and also shared a lot of examples of what kinds of that knowledge looks like. And a large part of the push or the advocacy for greater engagement of communities is especially around that. Is people don't want to be talked at in technical knowledge that doesn't resonate with them. People want to be sat with and have their perspectives listened to, their concerns and fears understood, and their needs explored outside of the ways in which usually engagement happens, which is not that. So okay, it works. So I'm going to move myself away so that I can talk. Okay. So I'm going to cover like why engagement matters, what the engagement gap is, a little bit of the IAP2 continuum, which many of you, if you're in this room from an engagement perspective, would be familiar with, and then talk a little bit about trustworthiness and trust. I've included some case examples from New Brunswick, but in modeling a little bit of what I would like to say, I'm not going to go into great detail about those examples because I don't know what they are, but the organizations involved are named in the examples. And so I would encourage those of you who are interested in learning more to connect with them. So let's start with why does community engagement matter? I hope we can all agree that it does. And I hope that we can all agree and resonate with what's written in here, because solutions or adaptation or arriving at a place that people feel like they are part of what is being done, that it's being done with them, not for them or to them, is a reason why community engagement matters. The definition of community and the breadth and depth and the variety of that notwithstanding. Engagement also reduces resistance, boosts trust, and turns plans into action. Coming into some communities to engage on climate when you've not engaged on many other things that communities have asked for example, at the municipal level, is an area where trustworthiness matters. And then co-creation and this idea of building together. So shifting the relationships and the relational dynamics around how communities are engaged with by those in various levels of government, and particularly in this case, municipalities that want to make decisions and create plans that are in service of community, but sometimes it's not communicated that way. The other reason it matters is it incorporates meaningfully community voices. So there's been a lot of engagement, certainly that I've been part of, or that I've attended, or that I've seen posters about that don't meet that meaningful mark. I live in Halifax, and for example, there are some redevelopment plan posters that are put on the back parking lot of a Walmart that residents wouldn't walk by or see. And so the question becomes, who is that for? And if you're driving by it, you're certainly not stopping to read it in great depth to understand what the information is that is on there. And so meaningful engagement is something there that I would emphasize in that one. The other one is establishing formal and informal pathways. The truth is, a lot of people don't want to do community engagement because it means building relationships. It means creating space and time for it, which means it takes time. And the informal nature of it, because you may need to engage in multiple ways, multiple times before you see any progress, is also a deterrent. And so establishing formal pathways to go along with the informal pathways is important, and those will show up in some of the examples that you see. However, I will say that who's represented on those committees and those roundtables and who's showing up in those workshops or not is an indicator that needs to be tracked and looked at, because there are some people who have the time, the money, the capacity. They're not working in precarious conditions. The advisory committees are happening at time, and roundtables are happening at times of day that they're available for versus other people who are caregiving, parents, the distance to travel. So just because I've put in established formal pathways there, doesn't mean that considerations don't need to be made for who's able to show up to that and why. The residents' input must influence actual decisions, so not just inform reports. Just very recently, I think yesterday or the day before, our council had community voices to come and speak up at a council meeting. That's great. I'm sure the residents who prepared their remarks felt good speaking up. But as somebody who participated in that session, the questions I have is, where's the transparency around what's actually going to happen with that? What is the purpose of the town halls and what is said in that town halls? And where is the long-term evidence that something is being done based on what people said? And so just to cap it off, I guess I will say engagement is a long-term relationship. It's not speed dating. It's not a blind date. It's not a one-off consultation. And certainly it's not reactive. There are some communities that the only ways in which they get action and traction is by blockades and showing anger and activism and advocacy, and that there are different relationships that various citizen groups, even let alone levels of government, have with that, where it is combative, and it's not necessarily the way in which we want to see engagement matters. And believe it or not, the communities who have reached that point of action also don't want that. People get there after they've tried all the other ways that are not working, and finally that's where we get to. The other thing is there's some communities that are only engaged when there's an infraction, when there is a fine, when there is some sort of bylaw permitting or non-permitting or regulational issue. That is still engagement, I guess is what I would say. But I think we need to clarify that when we say engagement, there are positive and supportive and uplifting types of engagement, and then there are engagements that are in reaction to complaints and protests. So in terms of nonlinear, iterative, and ongoing relationships, part of what is useful in the trustworthiness trust dynamic is this ability to be honest earlier, to build relationships that can withstand disappointment. And there is a reluctance to engage, sometimes because you're not sure how the dynamics are going to shift inside the communities of the various ways in which I'm talking about communities. So also, I don't want to fall into the trap of thinking when you say your community, it's a monolith and it's only one group of people. However, the purpose of ongoing relationships is that there are signals around unhappiness and dissatisfaction in places of tension start to show up earlier and can be managed for it very differently than constantly only responding to basically needing to do reactive restorative approaches after relationships have fractured. And so I would say being able to talk about constraints honestly, funding, legal, technical limits, and also being willing to say when the science was wrong or the context has shifted for the evidence that was being used. I think people have a lot of room for when people show up as humans and apologize or appreciate that there is disappointment when something that was committed to isn't being done. It's when it feels like a standoff or when it feels like people are being talked at and being given reports instead of connection. It says, plan stall. Also integrating lived experience shifts approaches, which is going to be my segue into the next piece. Who do we talk to or not? There's definitely a tendency to talk to people, if you think about it, based on the power that they hold, however power is defined, based on if I think about municipalities, the decisions around economic and tax benefits and return on investment. But as Michelle has already said, and I really love the two different ways that natural assets can be connected into and included in asset management, is we need to start to understand that there is value in community engagement. It's not this thing that you do rolling your eyes because you're being asked to. It actually is contributive and supportive to the types of communities that we want to live in and is just about being good neighbors. And I don't know that municipalities or levels of government necessarily consider themselves as neighbors in the communities that they're in. And I wish that we would, because they certainly have an outsized impact, speaking of power, in the communities that they're in. And so being a good neighbor means those with more power and capacity to impact should take more time than others to build the bridge of engagement. Combining technical realities with community needs. I'm not at all saying that this is simple. I actually have a background in science. I'm a plant biochemist. I understand that technical evidence sometimes is not as simple and easy to communicate in a town hall or in a workshop, but that doesn't mean that there are not ways to communicate the information that people can understand. And yes, it will take time. Yes, it requires a longer arc of planning and greater intentionality, but it doesn't mean that it's not valuable, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't reshape the way that we have conducted these processes. Without a shared understanding, policymakers may miss lived realities. And I don't know that I've seen publicly where that's been acknowledged. I would love to see more, not from a place of constantly showing that you were in the wrong, but to move the narratives into there is actually value in lived reality, and this is how it has shaped what has become feasible. An example that I don't know how long this will be a positive example, but I'm going to share it anyway. There's a series of dams in California that were, what do you call it, de-dammed. And for many years, people were skeptical of what would happen and if the fish would return, etc. And I believe in less than 18 months, the salmon came back. The reason I'm saying I don't know how positive this will be of a story is then what's happened is people are now illegally fishing the salmon that have returned, that are spawning in this shift. But I think that that's a good example, for example, and I would love to see where it's written up. I understood that some of the engineers involved won an award, but I would love to hear the write-up of, even though we were skeptical and even though the thought was that the recovery of these river systems was going to take this long, what is true is actually this has happened. And so therefore it supports communities and institutions across the world to see these positive examples. I guess that's what I'm trying to say is we probably don't talk to who we should talk to because we're not hearing enough positive examples of what happens when we do that. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about the International Association for Public Participation. Public participation and community engagement to me are not necessarily the same. And however, I do want to put this in here to clarify for those who don't know, and a refresher for those who do have their IAP2 certification, because I know that credentials are important, and this, I believe, is one of the go-to credentials for community engagement. Moving from information sessions to consultation to co-creation, I think really matters. And in community engagement, from my perspective, that is inclusive, that is equitable, that is considerate of whose knowledge counts and what kinds of knowledge, that really shifts the power dynamics in the relationships to what is being consulted on and who gets to call the consultation, whose meeting is it, why is it happening, moves communities from respondents to partners. It also creates shared ownership of both the problem and the possible solutions. I put in the solution, but I think sometimes the complexity of what we're dealing with, it's maybe tempting, but not useful to only think of single solutions. And sometimes that's where we get in trouble and why we get locked in faster than listening to what's showing up from communities, and particularly outliers in community. I share this slide every time I have conversations with people about planning and community engagement. I found it on someone from the UK's website, but it actually is adapted from the IAP2 by Paula Vinhas. Sorry if you can't read, it's cut off at the bottom, but when you receive the slides, you'll see the information. The Oasis School of Human Relations. And it really shows why the shift and what happens when you shift. There are some people who've had concerns about the word empower and that it's actually about co-powering because people have inherent power. It's just either it's abstracted from them or ignored or invisibilized. Take that where you will. But I did want all of us to see this because it's useful to track, not just to understand community engagement matters and why, but it's useful to track where you are on your scale of engagement and what you're seeing in the work that you're doing in terms of nature-based solutions based on where you are in the tracking of engagement. I really want to talk about trust through transparency and that trust is dynamic and not static. In recent conversations in some projects I've been in, there's been reluctance by people in municipalities and in various levels of government and organizations to do community engagement because of the concern that the expectations are too high or unreasonable or cannot be met. And I fully understand that, but I still think that there's value in community engagement, even just to say that, even just to say, whatever version of it is, a phone, a town hall, a 2-hour workshop, whatever optimal viable design engagement is, starting off by saying the concern is the expectations are too high and cannot be met. However, we want to be here to at least finish the sentence, however, is still valuable. Being at a standoff and being separate from community members is not optimal and not helpful, and only speaking to some and not others, and not building longer term relationships to understand what communities are experiencing is not useful. The other thing I just want to say as a human being who lives in Atlantic Canada, who, by the way, full disclosure, I didn't know that people were going to be from all over Canada on this. I thought it was just going to be in New Brunswick. I went to Mount Allison. The truth is, the people who are working at the municipality are also the community. You're going to see each other at sports. You're going to see each other as you're moving around in the places where you live your life. And so it's almost an invisible separation, even though I understand it, your professional and your personal life. I think the shift that I would emphasize is even with that, even though you are living and moving your life in community, you may still not be speaking to everybody in your community because we all have our own social fields. And so how you start to get to know more of what's going on in your geographic, temporal, and some communities are not actually based in place, they're based by affinity and interest, is by building trust through transparency, taking the time to be visible. And I cannot underemphasize working through trusted others. Michelle has already brought this up a little bit in terms of third-party entities who hold stronger, healthier, more meaningful relationships with some of the community subgroups that you would like to engage, feel free to use those intermediaries. I know that there are those who would be of the opinion that you should not. And I know that there is a risk of damaging the relationships that those people hold with the community groups that they're close to. However, the benefit is that they do understand the community groups that they hold relationships with, and they can be really good context translators and interpreters. And more harm might be done by not working with third parties. So I just want to emphasize that in case it's not clear. I think building trust and trustworthiness doesn't come up enough in conversations about engagement. And so I'm emphasizing it, and I put this slide in here to show that we have to make visible the power dynamics in what we're talking about. And we have to understand that sometimes the reactions or the ways in which people from community show up into the community engagement forms that we've designed is really around trust and the trustworthiness that needs to be built in a dynamic way. And I also want to say that even when it's fractured, repair is possible as long as there is an intent and a commitment to do it. Some of this you would know, but it feels like if I didn't check it off in a slide on community engagement, it wouldn't fly. So definitely consider literacy levels, language and culture, trauma aware and trauma informed perspectives in what are chosen as examples. And then I want to talk a little bit about co-creation in this slide, which I've already shown that continuum. And this is where working with trusted others, starting with community insights, I think is important. I will echo Michelle talked about that. And then this last one I think really, really matters is really, I think what Michelle and I are saying here is become brokers of knowledge, not just disseminators. Be interested in the types of knowledge that are not the technical or the ones that you're more comfortable with and used to. What do those knowledges and wisdoms show and tell, and why is that interesting? But more importantly, why does that matter for what we're trying to do? And be the bridge and create structured pathways as the bridge, because just as much as there are trusted third parties that you can work with, those of you who are in this webinar who are interested in this can be a trusted bridge to more technical. Considering who is missing at the table and inclusive outreach, I've talked about this, multilingual materials. There is a lot of Canada where people's first and second language are not English and French. And while we can all talk about how they should be, the risk of missing communicating with people because we don't acknowledge that as an issue. And I think some of us may remember through COVID, this was acknowledged and materials were prepared around vaccines and the pandemic and updates in many languages. So let's not roll back on that because we're not in the middle of a pandemic. Let's take the lessons of what we learned about community engagement from the pandemic and keep moving them forward. I also add in here necessary tools to support participation. There may or may not be reluctance to provide supports. However, the risk is you are only engaging with those who are privileged enough to have the supports that those who don't have them are missing. And so providing supports could be argued to be an equitable and inclusive approach, not biasing any engagement. These are the case examples that I said that I was going to share about. There's one, and I bolded them. Tantramar, EOS is a example of a third-party trusted group that I would say. There's a Port Elgin Iterative Climate. Sorry, the Zoom is in the way of the slide. Shignecta Watersheds, Riverview Mill Creek Nature Park, the Sackville Mayor's Roundtable, and then the Conservation Council Art Project. I'm added the art-based projects because that's another group and community that is often not included. The creative sector is not often considered in the context of engagement for other types of work that is happening, and yet creative community members are part of the community and actually might even be able to help with some of the translation, the generation, the visualization, but are also a group that needs to be consulted, period, because they live and work and move in the communities that we're in. So shout out to the arts. I would be remiss if I didn't raise these concerns and risks and limitations, that engagement is relational, emergent, and context dependent. These examples are illustrative and not exhaustive. We definitely need to pay attention to the power dynamics, and I would say try for your best, not perfection. It's a continuum. And please acknowledge that informal, grassroots, marginalized community voices, some that are very transient and not definitive enough that you can access a spokesperson or a group to reach. So I acknowledge that. However, it's worth considering who have you heard from a lot and who are you not hearing from, and move towards the silence. So for my background in evaluation, I would not end this without adding a slide of how do you know how you are doing at this? And so I provide 2 scorecards that I generated based on this presentation to track. So you will see this is the IAP2 Spectrum scorecard. The Empower part scored the lowest. The other scores were pretty good, thankfully. The evidence in the deck is about some advisory bodies, but the decisions are not that empowering because of the power dynamic. And so there's gaps and opportunities of what's possible to improve sharing of power in advisory groups and forums and roundtables. And then I also added a whole person approach scorecard, again, based on what's in this deck. One that was interesting to me is the contextual responsiveness one, which the case studies provide. And that's the value as well of working with trusted others, or so not, yes, having a role in engagement, but not assuming that it only needs to be two directional. There are multi-parties involved, and sometimes that's how we can maintain and repair trust and trustworthiness, but also get early signals of what's going on by maintaining multiple channels of communication. This is going to be coming to you in the slides so you can read it more yourself. But I don't wanted to share that these were ways that you could rate how you were doing in engagement. So this presentation provides some insights on why engagement matters, what it looks like or not, how to build lasting public support through inclusive outreach, co-designing workshops, other forms of engaging with community members, and providing transparency and updates. So not meeting one time and then people don't hear from you again for 18 months. And ensuring that local priorities, lived experience, other knowledges are represented, and then closing with some tools to track how well you are doing at it and know that you're moving to do the best that you can, not for perfection. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you very much, Louise. And Michelle as well. Let me share my slide again. Does anybody have any questions for either of our interveners today? There we go. Dedek, je vois que vous avez une question. Vous pouvez prendre le micro,
Dedek, you
s'il
have a
vous plaît.
question? You can go to the mic. Yes,
Yes,
hello,
hello
everyone.
everyone.
Sorry,
Sorry,
I made a mistake. I
I
made a mistake in the reaction icons. I think I wanted to put a thumbs up, and I put my hand up. But thank you very much for that series of webinars. Thank you very much to the presenters. It was great.
Et voilà, merci pour cette interjection. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks for your
We're running a
participation.
bit late, so I guess the questions for both Louise and Michelle. If you have them, you have your emails or contact me and I can get them in touch with you. Thanks again. Today's webinar was focused on community engagement and co-creation. Both Michelle and Louise have showed us how to use participatory planning to co-design nature-based solution with communities and stakeholders. The importance to educate the public on the benefits of nature-based solutions for health, resilience, quality of life, and also empower local stewards and citizen science initiatives, which are becoming more and more available. So join us next week for part 4, knowledge, data, and capacity building, where our speakers Armin Nika from Climate Atlantic and also Amanda Marlin from Climate Atlantic. It'll be a Climate Atlantic Day next week. Will present their work on enhancing the understanding of climate change and develop local expertise through training and peer learning. Before we leave the subject of community engagement and co-creation, I'd like to highlight some work being done by one of our webinar organizing partners, Nature Canada. If you get a chance, take a look at Nature Canada's website. There's a lot of terrific information there. And part of that is a nature-based solutions project map. If you or your group have already been working on nature-based climate solutions in your community, we'd love for you to share your project. By submitting your initiative on this project map, you can help inspire other groups across the country. And you can submit your project to Nature Canada's national project map via the link posted in chat. If you look at the map here, it's interesting to note that there's a lot of them in Atlantic Canada, notably in New Brunswick. So the ball is rolling. Let's keep on pushing it so we can, increase the nature-based solutions in our area and across Canada for that. If you haven't already done so, follow us on our social medias and register for next week's event, part 4 of this 4-part webinar series. Next week on February 5th, again, it'll be knowledge, data, and capacity building. Et finalement, un gros merci
and a big thanks to Andre Muse for his work as an interpreter today, and Paul Gregory and our team, Nature Canada, Adam Cheeseman, Nature New Brunswick, colleagues Eleanor Excel from our New Brunswick Environmental Network, and all of the speakers and everyone who's joined us today. And thanks to the New Brunswick Environmental Trust Fund, makes this project possible, and the support of the for bilingualism fund. And thank you.